Hello and welcome everyone. Really pleased to have you along this afternoon or this morning or this evening, depending where you are in the world. It's always fabulous to be able to talk with John Hattie. Unfortunately, this one's a pre-recording, but it's excellent and it's absolutely jam-packed and stuff around the world's biggest learning survey. So what we want to do is share some of the results with you, share the conversation that we had around them, and then we're going to move on to how you can participate, because we're really pleased that there's another 500 free surveys. These are whole school learning surveys available from our friends at Jurio. They're going to be coming out in November, so you need to sign up for them now. It's on a first come first served basis and they're going fast. That could be across a whole school group if you want. That could be just for your school. So you just need to sign up, and there'll be a link in the chat section for that, or you can just go to osiriseducational.co.uk. My name's Stephen Cox. I'm CEO of Osiris Educational. So I did have quite a lot to do with this survey. So if you want to get in touch with me, I'm just Stephen@osiriseducational.co.uk. That's Stephen with a PH. The full report on the first learning survey will be out tomorrow. So you can get there again on that link. If you just click on that link, and we'll send that one across to you so you can delve into the details and pull it apart. The webinar will be on share and repeat after this webinar, so it'll be available for you to share with colleagues, unpick it, think what the implications here, what we're talking about. Just a quick reminder, we are the exclusive providers of Visible Learning, which is John Hattie's program. So if you want to find out more about that and how you can impact on learning and to a greater degree, and I think one of the things that a lot of schools that we're working with at the moment are finding is just the most amazing implementation mechanism and platform. So it covers anything that you want it to. Whilst the focus is learning, it can be learning about well-being or anything else you need it to focus on. John Hattie himself will be joining us live in March. So he's available for schools or groups of schools. If you wanted to get in touch with us about that, that's going to be available. And then he'll also be joining us for WES 23. That's the World Education Summit. If you've not been before, that'll be run from the 20th of March to the 23rd of March in 2023. So without more ado, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of here. Then we'll have a bit of questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, just please put them in the chat forum and we'll do our best to answer those, or I'll get John to answer them directly later. And then we'll just repeat this information at the end. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us live. And Becca, play VT, please. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Professor John Hattie. We will just call him John from now on. Former director of the Melbourne Research Institute, director of the amazing ASTL project in New Zealand, which really reinvented the whole way that you can do assessment. The meta-analysis he's undertaken became termed as the holy grail of education and forced us to look at what we meant by impact. His work in Auckland with Vivian Robinson was just an amazing understanding of leadership and how teaching and learning all come together, and then really leading on this whole notion across the world of what the impact narrative means and what it means through the development of what became called visible learning, and what John's probably most well known for now across the world. 10 years, and I'm not sure how many schools you're working across now, John. How many countries?
Well, it's about 10,000 in about 23 countries.
So you must be immensely proud of that work in terms of just to have that level of impact and be able to have that reach. And I know you advise governments all over the world.
And it's a pleasure being here at the World Education Summit with you, Stephen, Anne Marie, and with all the participants out there. What an incredible opportunity to share ideas, to hear critics, and to advance what we are so passionate in.
So that's it. I mean, John, I'm really open for questions and comments. So just keep those pouring in. We'll be features for you as policy makers, for you as school leaders, and what you could be doing as a result, and also how you can participate in it. So John's going to share that screen with you now. And as that one comes up, so what we're going to start unpacking is, well, what do we really mean by learning? Because if we can't nail what we mean by learning, it becomes much more difficult then. So I'm just going to give you that challenge in a second, John. Can we just kind of unpack a little bit about learning? Because you are probably the world's learning guru now. I know you don't like the words guru or anything like that, but what do we really mean by learning if we're going to do a survey of it?
All right. We do want to look at this notion of the learning survey, but I want to start back a little bit and ask the question about focus on learning. Now, I want to start with a criticism. And the criticism that a philosopher has come up with, Geert Baster, is that too much focus on what he calls learnification is taking the attention away from teaching. But I see teaching as learning. I see learning not only as a mechanism, a means to an end, but you only need to watch many, many teenagers on their iPhones and their apps to realize that many of them are in love with learning. Yes, it's always about something. It's always about who. And yes, it also relates to what the magnitude of that effect is. But today we're going to talk about this notion of learning and try and place it back at the core of what we're doing in the classroom, particularly as a means to getting the higher achievement, the higher investment, and the higher liking of the material that we teach in schools. We'll look at the scope of the survey, what its key findings are, and we'll finish on how to get involved. We've administered the survey now in 87 schools around the world, 29,000 people. And as you see, it's relatively brief. A lot of work went into the development of the survey. We did many trials of it before we got going. We've got lovely factor analysis, all the reliability and stuff, which is absolute minimum to the defence of this kind of survey.
Focused as you, what sort of reliability is that giving us?
Well, on a scale of 0 to 1, 0.93 is pretty healthy. And what it basically means is that you can trust that the scores coming out of the survey are pretty consistent over time. So if a student was doing this over many different occasions, we'd get similar kinds of results. And it's one of the criteria, minimum criteria for a good test. The other is procedures like factor analysis. It needs to come out showing that the scale's working, and it does all those kind of things. So the basic message of that, Stephen, is you can have some confidence.
That's fantastic to know. So then we go on to this twin tracks approach, because I know a lot of your work focuses on, well, what does learning progress look? And the visible learning work that people will be more familiar with will look at that progress element.
Yeah, and it's through progress that you get higher achievement. Sometimes I worry that schools are so obsessed with achievement that we know students progress in multiple ways. There's no one right track. We really should talk about learning progressions and understanding where the student has been, where they are now, and where they need to get next is the essence of great teaching. But the other part of what we want to do here is we do need to better understand what it means to develop the learner. Like, I find it amazing, Stephen, that teachers out there have thousands, if not tens of thousands of measures of achievement. Teachers can make up a measure of achievement for a minute, 5 minutes. But how many measures of learning have we got? And what does it mean to be a great learner? Well, this notion of progression. It's this notion of how we make decisions about curriculum, the access to it, obviously the behaviour management of getting kids to engage in activities. And this word engagement is always fascinating. Now, when Amy Berry and our team asked hundreds of teachers, how do you know kids are engaged? The common answer was, they're doing the work. They're involved in the work. They're completing the work. Well, sadly, in a lot of doing, sometimes there's not much learning. And one of our mistakes is seeing engagement in terms of just participating. It requires much more attention than that. It requires teaching the kids to drive and strive. It's to teach them not to avoid, disrupt, or withdraw. It's getting them beyond engagement. And the other part of the equation we want to emphasize is the 3 levels of knowing. Classrooms are pretty dominated by knowing that. The facts, the content, the ideas. And there's a conspiracy out there as well. Kids above average want teachers to spend even more time on the facts and the knowledge, because that's the game they're good at. They are the winners. We then move to knowing how, the more deeper, the relational, how we make relationships between ideas, how we have deeper conceptual understanding. And then there's the knowing with, which is where surely, the point of education and teaching anything is so that students can then transfer what they learn with to other circumstances. Now, the difference between knowing how and knowing with is not as great as the difference between knowing that and knowing how. Now, I got no time, Stephen, for this crazy notion that one's better than the others. Facts are better than inquiry. We need to know knowledge and precious knowledge and not have deeper understanding and problem solving. I'm greedy. I want them all. And I think we need to be a lot more attentive to making sure that in our lessons, we attend to not only the knowledge and the precious knowledge that students need to have, but also how they use it and how they go on to use it with other circumstances. And being smart about that is pretty critical.
Balance between the progression as a learner, but also that development as a learner. And I think here it's quite useful to unpick a little bit more. And I know we got your visible learning and the science of how we learn, which is a very useful introduction into where this sits. But this whole kind of metacognition, self-regulation element.
Yeah, and it's like when you're first teaching a new concept, a new piece of material to the students, then maybe 80 to 90% of the time on knowing that is reasonable. But heaven help if we stop there. And like when we analysed classroom instruction, and we have about 20,000 hours of transcripts of classroom discussion, classrooms, 90% of what's talked about in class is about the facts. And that's it. Surely that's not the right balance. Now, again, I got nothing wrong with knowledge and facts, but getting that balance right and having that right time to know when you move from knowing that to knowing how and knowing with is pretty critical. And one of the things that we also want to do is we want to develop the students. Now, here's the problem. Some of the strategies that you use when you're learning the facts and the content are not the same strategies that are successful when you learn the deeper. And the concept that underlies teaching students to know when to be surface, when to be deep, is this thing we call self-regulation. Like, I'm sure you know, Stephen, we love jargon, strategy. It doesn't work. So they reapply that same strategy and they wonder why it doesn't work again. How are we as teachers in front of that game knowing when kids, what strategies they're using? And if they are getting it incorrect, making sure they've got at least an alternative strategy. One of the fascinations is that when we were writing up our work on learning, we decided to look through those 20,000 hours and ask the question, when was an occurrence when a teacher explained the strategy they were using, how to solve a problem out loud, or when they listened to a student explaining the strategy they were using, or when they taught the student an alternative strategy. In 20,000 hours, there was actually zero occurrence of that happening.
Within education or even education of teachers, really, very much.
Well, it's worse than that, Stephen. When I ask participants today, how do they learn? Even us who are in the education business and the teaching business, sometimes we struggle with the language of how we learn. And we wonder why kids think it's a deep hole of mystery. And our point is it does not need to be, and nor should it need to be.
So
the other thing,
sorry. I was going to say what we're talking here is making explicit the implicit element of learner development.
And the simplest way of saying all this is let's teach our students to become their own teachers. So they know what to do when they don't know what to do. That they have got alternative strategies when the first doesn't work. In the same way we in classroom as teachers, we have alternative strategies when the first teaching method doesn't work. Same with our students, how we can get smart about it. So this brings us on to the survey, Stephen. And it turns out through our factor analysis, there are three major aspects of the survey about what teachers do, about what students see as learning, and this notion of safety. And you can see there that students, we ask them about to what degree are they going to help? Will their teachers help? And it's really interesting, when we first ask the students, what do you do when you get stuck? Nearly every kid in the world says the same thing. I asked the teacher. Well, there was a really good study that observed what happens when kids put their hand up and the teacher picked on them and said, Stephen, what's the answer? And Stephen gets it wrong. 50% of the time, the teacher corrected you, Stephen. 50% of the time, the teacher asked another student who corrected you. Less than 3% of the time did the teacher use that error as an opportunity to learn. What does Stephen say when he sits there and all that's happening is he's being corrected or another kid's correcting him? He's not going to ask for help. And when you look at the kids who put their hands up, the only kids who put their hands up in class are the kids who know the answer or think they know the right answer. So for some kids, they learn very quickly. The teacher's not there to help you. They also want teachers to be enthusiastic about their learning. And they want fairness of anything in the class. Like when you ask them about discipline, they'll have a teacher who's very strict over a teacher who's unfair. That when it comes to learning,
includes the enthusiasm for the student and the student's development in their learning, including the feedback process. Is it a hierarchical one where it's all coming down one way, or does it feel like a shared experience of it? Yeah.
And what we're tapping into here is the student's experience of that enthusiasm. Like, no kid should come to school to learn that which they already know. It's what they don't know. And some kids are terrified of challenge. Probably the ones that strike me the most are adolescent gifted kids. Like, I think it's really a phenomenal interest to note that most gifted kids do not become gifted adults. Less than 2% of child prodigies become gifted adults. And the major reason is that when they're asked to go into areas that they're not got a deep knowledge over, they're terrified of failure. What's worse, so are their parents. How do we get that challenge right? And how do we also then set those high expectations and aim high so that we use the Goldilocks principle of challenge, not too hard, not too easy, and not too boring. And again, I remind you of Graham Nuttall's work where he found that every class, 40 to 50% of everything taught the kids know already. The problem in some schools is the work's too easy. It's just doing. No wonder some kids get bored. So how do we aim high? And then this one we want to unpack a little bit more in a moment, this notion of learning strategies. Then we look to safety, and you can probably see why those two are pretty critical, because we want the students to see errors as opportunities. We want teachers to see errors as opportunities. We want failure to be the learner's best friend. We want safety so that you don't get embarrassed either by the teacher or, more likely, by your peers when you don't know. And so these are the 9 areas that we looked at in the survey.
As well, because I love the data on this, and it's so important. Yes, it's important that teachers have high expectations for children, 0.46 effect size. It's really important that parents have high expectations of their children, 0.7, but the most important of the lot becomes children's expectations of themselves. And therefore, then the role of the teacher starts to become to disrupt those expectations, around about 1.36, I think, from the data there. So the teacher's role is often to disrupt the expectations.
Well, particularly if students set low expectations and think that all they're going to do is get a C or a pass, yeah, we should disrupt that.
So we're getting lots of comments in here, and how do we change it? And this is where we're getting into now. Let's have a look at the data and what the data says then. First of all, so what we've done is clearly identified 4 phases in this learning process. The first one, we'll call EXO. This is what the children bring to themselves prior to entering into the classroom. So it's the knowledge that they bring in, but also their development as a learner. And I think your early work suggested that that was 50% of what they were bringing in and what the end result would be. So selective schooling does work very well for those who are selected for the right schools, I guess. And then this second element is this macro one, which is where we're looking at here at the school climate and culture, what the leaders bring to the organization and how that can be changed. The third element then is the micro, what's going on in the brain, almost going on between I don't know this, or that understanding that I don't know this, and what happens, does the brain open up at that point, or does it close down to the opportunity to learning? So, you know, it's a very, very tight focus in that one.
Well, let's look at some results, Stephen. Students absolutely want to aim high. They want challenge. But sadly, you can see it pretty dramatically. They see their errors as embarrassments and negatives, and partly that's because school isn't as fair, as safe as they want it to be. This is a really powerful message, and I really ask all people there who are going into a class over the next few days to note particularly what happens when errors are made by the teacher, by the students, because we have to make it much more safe to do that, because every student has to get at that edge and go into territory they don't know and make mistakes. But we found it fascinating that, as you said before, Stephen, the expectations are high. They see the teachers enthusiastic. They want challenge and they want to aim high.
But there's this issue in this kind of fail, that notion of fail, first attempt in learning, which is kind of a nice acronym. You see it in schools all over the place. But what we're finding is that at least half the time half the pupils are finding this more as a point of humiliation than a first attempt in learning. Is that reasonable to say? Absolutely correct. Yes. And then not wanting to revisit it. And it's quite frightening when then we look at the data then. And it's not just in schools across the UK, it's across the world where half the kids are coming out consider, or at least perceiving themselves as failures within the educational game. And it starts very early. Now, here's the other one that surprised us all. All these things decrease as kids go through school. Like in the early primary years, Key Stage 1, that's where my grandkids are at the moment. They are so excited to go to school to learn. After a while, they start to get turned off. That's that compliance notion that some of them resist, particularly the adolescent area, where they're saying, hey, I want to be more motivated to study this rather than that. I want more help. Maybe it's because they've realized their place in the classroom, and their place in the classroom is to look like they know and hope they don't get picked on. But I do think it's a major worry that this concept of learning decreases as kids go from early primary right through to secondary school. Because of that? I think a lot of it is peer pressure to the way in which we game schools. Like I'm watching my 6-year-old at the moment. You know, she's learning that if she doesn't answer teachers' questions, put up a hand, look like she's involved and do all the work, school's not for her. And so she's going to learn by age 8 whether this place school's for her. And that's where the slow drop-off happens for many kids. And I just wonder, Stephen, why it is. My three-year-olds, I got 2 3-year-old grandkids, they are obsessed with why questions, curious about their world. Emma already is switching at age 6 from why to what. And I sometimes think we take the love of that curiosity out as we go up. We don't indulge in opening up to the students' questions about what they don't know. Here it is again, so that they can actually take risks and challenges to go into territories they don't know. Now, we know that 6, 7 and 8-year-olds, many of them are very, very rule governed and rule compliant. But sometimes I think we feed that. And the children all wearing masks might even, have dampened this one down further. Well, maybe, Stephen, but I put the opposite spin on this. I think that many teachers and students realised during COVID that students are much more willing to acknowledge errors, acknowledge what they don't know using social media than they are even if you're standing beside them. And I think that's the revolution on technology. Now, I know when TV came out, you maybe remember this, Stephen, you may be younger than me, it was seen as the evil. People see social media as the evil. Well, get over it, guys. We have to learn how to use it. The students are using it, and they are learning so much in social media. Yes, it's got its downsides, but I put it to you, if you want to turn around getting students to talk about what they don't know, social media may be one platform. And certainly we've got Sal Khan coming later on in the summit, who'll be quite revolutionise the whole way that you can look at education. So that's fascinating. Thank you, John. We looked around 90 schools in this first set of data.
And we just wanted to say, was this a school issue or was this a kid issue? Well, sorry, schools, there's a massive school issue here. If you look at the difference between the highest and the lowest schools, oh my goodness, where do you want your kids to go? You could see the contrast between the highest and the lowest 20 schools is very, very marked on every one of those dimensions. And I think this is a major source of concern here. And I think this is why when you complete the survey, no school name is identified. The only people who know is yourselves. But when you contrast yourselves with other schools, you can see some schools have got a lot of growing to do. They've got a lot of deep thinking to do about what it means to be a learner in your school. Want to make any comments there, Stephen?
What's the difference between the 25% and the 25%, I guess, at the bottom and at the top? So we're getting some questions around how can we do this in practice? What do we need to do? And I know we'll get onto those in a moment, but certainly here's one where the leadership can sit down and say, you know, what does learning look like in our school? And I think we've got some really nice categories there for them to break down between and say, yeah, you know, where are we on this stage? And I'll talk about how you can participate in the learning survey in a moment.
Well, one of the things you can do right now, where we start, is go around your classrooms, randomly ask 4 or 5 kids, who's the best learner in this class and why? Do the same with the teacher. Summarise what the teachers say and summarise what the kids say. Now, in the schools that are in the lowest 20 schools there, I will bet those students say, oh, a good learner is someone comes to class well prepared, sits up straight and watch the teacher and watches the teacher work. The top classes, top schools there would be saying the opposite. Learning is a struggle. Learning can be messy. Learning means we have to try different ideas, sometimes 2 or 3 times. Learning, come up with 4 or 5, no more than 7. It gets too many after that. 4 or 5 or 6 concepts of what it means to be a learner in your school. And then the hard part starts, Stephen, implementing that in the classroom. And that's where we want to go down the line. Boys are more confident than girls. And we have there prefer not to say another, and there's about 400 students there. It's not a lot, but there are some hints there that maybe school isn't as inviting for them as it perhaps should be. And just because boys are more confident doesn't mean always that that's a good thing. They may be all confident in the wrong way. But overall, you can see that not really. Boys are actually more confident about being a learner in schools than girls. We've got some work to do. And now that I've got 4 granddaughters, that's dear to my heart. We took out the English schools and we looked up their Ofsted rankings. Ofsted doesn't care about learning. In fact, the outstanding schools have at times the lowest profile on learning. My hunch is that they're very compliant, very rule governed, and sadly that is not a good predictor for students' futures. I have also a hunch, Stephen, that when you read through those reports, hardly ever do they say anything other than, oh, the learning was great in the school. There was virtually nothing from the student's perspective what it means to be a learner. It was through these inspectors' eyes. They go into classrooms and they look at teachers and they see what they do and they assume the experience of the students. Quite frankly, that's criminal. Unless we get an understanding, as well as the teachers and the school leaders, for what it means to be a student. This is why I think it's a sin to go into a classroom and watch a teacher teach. How can I, 70-year-old, a 50-year-old, a 30-year-old, how can I stand in the shoes of a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old and do that? We need to pause and include asking the student's voice about what it means to be a learner as part of that equation. And I think there's some pretty serious problems there that we are, or you are in your country, reinforcing and rewarding schools that do not have necessarily the best learning environment.
Wondering where in the world is there an inspection regime where they do have the right focus on learning? Because I'm with you all the way on Ofsted, because I've had the conversations both with ministers and with high up senior officials in Ofsted, and I think learning is deliberately missed out. And you've got to ask the question, why is it deliberately missed out? But it's not an accident. But I'm just wondering where in the world's really embraced this and taken it right into the inspection process, so it does have the teeth behind it as well.
Well, the trouble with inspection processes around the world is that once you put them in place, Stephen, they're very, very hard to kill off. And unfortunately, they change their focus every 3 or 4 years as the new leaders come to the inspected agency. So they dramatically change. Like I know from my days in New Zealand, they had a very good period where talking with the students, getting their voice alongside was welcomed and encouraged. Then it stopped. Then it started again. But that whole inspection regime is to these outsiders to come in and look. And it costs time and money to involve the students. Now, our argument is simple. What are they asked to see? Data from surveys such as this one. And more importantly, ask the school, and what are you doing about it? That's what really matters, is the action that schools are taking as a consequence of this. That's what I would do if I was the inspectorate, is not go in and talk to the students, because how can you get 5-year-old and 7-year-olds who are struggling in class with their struggle and not seeing it acknowledged or even welcomed? I'm not going to talk to outsiders. I'm much more interested in this, as New Zealand did for a while, asking the school to interpret its evidence and judging them on the basis of that.
Health and stuff like that, but we never talk about learning about well-being and learning about mental health. And I guess these could be on a similar context if we've got an understanding of learning and we've got a real emphasis.
What's your bet?
I'm going to say, I don't know. Go on.
Boredom.
I'm sorry, I should know. That's what Csikszentmihalyi said 20 odd years ago when he did exactly a very similar survey on flow. Yeah, apathy and boredom.
Now look at those data. What do kids want? They want high expectations, challenge, and aiming high. That's the antithesis of boredom. The work's too easy. They're just doing stuff. Oh my gosh. Now, don't get me wrong. What keeps me going is there's some stunning classes and schools out there, and we've been in them together, Stephen, where you see that buzz of challenge, where you see kids going to the edge of their knowing and going overboard into the learning pit. Wow, it's out there. So what about some of the recommendations? Now, I'll give the viewers a chance to look down that list, and I've already mentioned number 6, which is the favourite place that I like to start. One of the things we did 5 years ago here at Melbourne is we abolished special ed from our faculty. It didn't go down well with some. There was a bit of a hue and a cry. Some people left in anger. And instead we brought in a new professor who said, and we said to her, we want this program to be about learning interventions. Every one of those special needs, kids with special needs a learning intervention. And what's really phenomenal, Stephen, is now every student in our teacher education program thinks that way. Every student needs a learning intervention. Every student, we need to understand what strategies they're using, when they're using them, do they know how to use them? We need to build into our teaching at least once a day. Today we're going to learn a new strategy about how to learn. We're going to learn how to outline. Like, that's the most powerful strategy when you're first exposed to new information. And I invite our viewers out there to go into class tomorrow, talk for 10 to 15 minutes, tell the students what you're doing and say, I want you to take notes. I want you to do an outline, do a summary. I'm going to give you a few moments afterwards to fix it, then hand it in. Some students will hand in a blank sheet of paper. Worse, some will hand in a verbatim script, which means nothing is happening up here. If they don't have the ability to summarize and see the big ideas, then all you do all day as a teacher is just flow out data, flow out facts, and it just flows over their heads. They have no coat hangers to hang it on. And so what are some of the strategies we need to teach? Have someone observe your class or take a video and watch what happens. Who puts their hands up and who doesn't? Is it all the kids who know or think they know? Shirley Clark says, use your paddle pops, randomly pick kids and get them to realize that everyone's going to be called on. But you've got to watch very carefully what the reaction of peers are. Peers can be quite nasty in many invidious ways. I want school to be inviting in there. But how good are our learners? Stephen?
to be a great learner? Well, a great learner is going to have to be, yes, learning the subject matter and whatever the curriculum offers, but I think there's a much wider dimension in that in terms of the extracurricular offering, the dispositional development of learners as well, which, you know, throws this right through to mental health well-being, as you suggested there, but also this core one of how they're developing as a learner. And I just love that. It's such a simple idea. If every child in your school is on a learning intervention, then everyone feels included. I mean, on a personal level, my daughter's got quite a strong dyslexic profile. She's not a dyslexic because she wouldn't go near the test, because then they would label her, and then she's already been through the process of what does an intervention look like for her, because it means hauling her out. So she won't let that happen to her. She'll suffer the time consequences and everything. And you're thinking, yes, but if every kid in the class was on a learning intervention, then hers would just be specific to hers, and every single one would be specific to them, and we're all working in the same way.
We love to label, sadly, in our business. Unlike in the medical profession, where when you label a disease or a problem you have, that's the first step to intervention. Sadly, in education, we often label to explain why kids can't. And that's very, very unfortunate. So yeah, I'm with you. Every kid needs a learning intervention, and it's a very healthy way to set your programs up.
So I think someone was asking, what's the one takeaway? If we're going to give a takeaway, maybe that's it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for that. So absolutely enlightening from John Hattie. There's a lot more detail if you get into the report. So just a reminder, you can get a replay of this. But I know someone said that they were struggling a bit with the sound. That's often just because at 4 o'clock there's a massive load on the internet. So it may be a local thing, because we weren't experiencing the same thing, although there was a crossover with the time difference in Melbourne and getting the interactivity between the three of us. So hopefully that was really helpful and gives you a load of more information about the learning survey. The big one is, if you want to participate, all you've got to do is click on the link and it's there, or go onto the Osiris Educational website, or if you want to just contact myself, Stephen at osiriseducational.co.uk, we'll get you onto that learning survey. As I said, there's 500 whole school surveys, which is a really good point to start with, because it gives you a baseline. It'll give you a comparison then when the report comes out. Our next report will be out in January, probably late January, and that then you've got that then to hold on to for your school and take it forward. As mentioned, John Hattie will be in the UK in March, late March 23. So if you've got an event on around then, or you'd like to plan an event with John Hattie, please get in contact with us, and we can facilitate that and make that one happen. John Hattie is only in the UK exclusively with Osiris Education, which is a real pleasure. I've known John for about 11 years now, and what a person to work with. Very humble about his own findings, but just a brain that drags together every bit of information that comes out, both at policy level right through to individual school and pupil level, and then puts it all together in a format. And that's really what the Visible Learning Plus program is. And then don't forget, John will also be joining us at the World Education Summit, 20th to the 23rd of March 2023. That'll be our third World Education Summit. We're really looking forward to do that. So that's all. Those are what's happening out there. So we'll put this on the recording pretty soon after, so please share it with people. And yes, you can get the recording as a download as well, so you can just listen to it rather than have the full thing, although that's more difficult, obviously, without the graphs there. So thank you very much for your time. I hope it was well spent. If there are any other questions, as I say, just Stephen at osiriseducational.co.uk. Enjoy the rest of term. Now that everything's settling down a little bit, I hope we can say that. And we'll see you again shortly.